Okay, so today, Unit 5.5, we're going to solve quadratics by completing the square. Has anyone ever heard of completing the square before? Yes. Some of you? Okay, so basically, when you are solving a quadratic equation, there are multiple ways you can solve it. Okay? So we know that we can factor sometimes. When factoring doesn't work, we can use the quadratic formula. And then there also is completing the square. Okay, now I realize that you can solve these any way that you want to, and you should end up coming up with the correct answer. But you need to understand how to complete the square, because oftentimes you'll get questions like, what would the square be if you were completing the square, kind of thing. So you would need to understand this way. Even though you wouldn't necessarily have to do it this way, you could use like the quadratic formula or something like that. Do you get what I'm saying? Okay. So, yes. So example 1, we want to make this side a square. If you look at this, what two numbers multiply to be a positive 16 and add to be a negative 8? Negative 4, right? You would write that as x minus 4, x minus 4. Do we? Hold on a second. Do we agree with that? Yes? So, but we want to write that as a square. So I'm really going to write this, hold on one second, as x minus 4 squared equals 25. Yes?
Can't you subtract the 16 over to the 25 and factor the x squared minus 8 at the same time?
Yes, but that's not what we're going to do right this minute, okay?
Would it turn out to the same answer?
Well, that's what I'm saying, is there's lots of different ways that you can factor.
I just want to know if
No, it would not end up the right way, because when you're factoring, either it needs to be set equal to 0 if you're going to factor or use the quadratic formula. Okay, so this goes back to like what we did yesterday, where once you have your square by itself, what can you do? Take the square root. So we're going to take the square root of both sides.
x minus 4 plus or minus 5.
So we have x minus 4 equals plus or minus 5. And then from there, what am I going to do? Good. So we're going to have x minus 4 equals 5. X minus 4 equals negative 5. We add 4 and get x equals 9. And we add 4, x equals negative 1. Those are my two answers. X equals 9 and negative 1. Do you want me to show you how if I were to subtract 25 and set it equal to 0 that you'd end up getting the same answer? You guys trust me? Okay.
Wait, so you can't subtract 25?
You can. You could subtract 25, make it set equal to 0, and you could factor. But we're using this one to show how completing the square works. Okay, so can you try example 2 on your own? And I want you to just start by, can you write this as a square? Can you write x squared minus 18x plus 81 as a square? Yeah. Okay, so what is our square for this one? Okay, x minus 9 squared equals 5. Are we good? Okay, so what's your next step here? Good, take the square root of both sides. Now, so we get x minus 9 equals what? Good. Positive or negative square root 5. Because can I break 5 down and get a pair and bring it out? No. So is there any point in setting this into two separate equations? No, because I'm not going to be able to combine anything together, right? And so what would I do to finish this? You would just add 9 to both sides. And your answer would be x equals 9 plus or minus root 5. So the first part of your homework today is doing something just like what we did here, okay? Okay, the next part, they're going to just ask you sometimes to write something as a perfect square trinomial. So again, this goes back to just the other examples we already did. This factors to be x plus 9, which is x plus 9 squared. That's your perfect square trinomial. Okay? This one would end up factoring to be what? This would be x minus 4 squared as your perfect square trinomial.
That's right, Ms. Walker.
Okay, so sometimes you don't have an equation like this that is all nice and pretty and will make a perfect square. Okay? So we're going to talk about how you can always make a square in a problem. Okay? When you're going to find your perfect square, you need a value for c that is basically you take half of b and square it. If you look back up here at 18, what is half of 18? 9. And what's 9 squared? Okay, so to get this c value, you take half of that middle number and you square it, which means that when you square a negative, for instance, if I take half of negative 8, it is negative 4. And what is negative 4 squared? A positive 16, right? Which is right here. Okay, so on the next part of your homework, what they want you to do is write this as a perfect square and tell them what value you would want c to be. So on 16, you always take, or sorry, on A, you take your 16 and we divide it by 2, which is what? 8. And then you square it to get what you want your c value to be. And what is 8 squared?
64.
So my c value is 64. And then they also want you to write that as a perfect square if this were 64. And so what would that be?
X squared plus 16x plus 64.
The perfect square would be x plus 8 squared. It's your half number. Okay? So whatever is half of 16, that's the number that goes in there, right? Which we saw from all of these other examples that we've been doing. Yes?
You write it x plus 8 squared.
No. So they're on this one, there's two separate answers. They want to know what is your c value, and the c value we would need is 64. And then they also want you to, so find c, which is that, and then write as the square of a binomial, and that's your square. Okay? So on B, what would we do to find out what we want for our c value?
Divide the negative 2 by 2.
Good. Negative 2 divided by 2 equals what?
Negative 1.
Negative 1.
So that's
And negative 1 squared is what?
1.
1. So that means that my c value would need to be
1.
1. Okay, and how would I write that as a perfect square?
X minus 1 squared.
Yep.
I'm getting this.
Do we have questions right now?
No.
So if you ended up giving the c value that we said we needed, which was a positive 1,
Will always
this would factor to be x minus 1 times x minus 1, because those multiply to be positive 1 and they add to be a negative 2. So we write that as x minus 1 squared. So they want to know what's your c value plus what's your square. Yes?
will we always be able to divide that to get a number that a decimal?
No, in fact, well, okay, so C is an example of this. In your homework, you might have one question. On your test, they'll always be perfect. Okay? But I'm just going to show you how you would deal with this, okay? So on here, if we take negative 15 and we divide it by 2, can I reduce that? No. So just leave it as an improper fraction, okay? And then if you were to square this, we just square the top, square the bottom. And what is 15 squared, or negative 15 squared?
30.
No. 225 is correct. And then we also squared 2, which is 4. So that's my C value, 225 over 4. We just leave it as a fraction. And then in your parentheses, you're just going to leave that number as a fraction. So it would be x minus 15 over 2 squared. So you might have one question similar to this in your homework, but on your test, they'll all end up making a number, not a fraction. Okay? Okay, questions up to this point?
So you put the 15 over 2
2 in the answer instead of the 225 and the 4?
Right, because remember that the 225 over 4 represents what your C would be.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and then what goes in here is always the half number. Okay, moving on. So this is just kind of set up how your homework is. So it's like having you practice this stuff until you get to a problem where you're actually kind of doing the work that you are meant to do. So when you are completing the square, you want to get the equation so that your x's are on one side and your plane number is on the other. So what I mean by that is you have this equation x squared plus 6x equals 16. Do you see how all the x's are on one side and then my plane number that doesn't have an x is on the other side? Do we understand that? Okay, so if you're completing the square, that's what you want to do. Okay? Then, to complete the square, because we want to make a C value, that will make it a square.
I know how to do it.
Okay? Okay, so what you do is we end up making, I have a box here, but I normally just make a blank to save myself time. So what you do is you write x squared plus 6x plus blank equals 16 plus blank. Okay? Now, the reason why I have two blanks is because whatever I do to one side, I also have to do to the other side to make a balance, so it's fair, right? Okay? So then we do, so you always take your middle number here, 6, and we go 6 divided by 2 is what? 3, and then you square that number, which makes 9. So if you look, 9 is now the value that went in for both of those blanks.
So now
Then you write, okay, and this is kind of already done for you. Then we write x squared plus 6x plus 9. That perfect square is x plus 3 squared. And then we simplify this. 16 plus 9 is 25. And then remember at this point, now that we have the square by itself, we square root both sides, right? We get x plus 3 equals plus or minus 5. And then you make your two equations to get the two answers, which in this case are 2 and negative 8.
So we're going to do that right now,
So now we're going to do that on examples 4 and 5.
which is pretty easy.
Okay, so we want our x's on one side and the plane numbers on the other, okay? So on this one, that's already done, right? Do you see how the x is on the left and the plane numbers on the right? Yes? So now we want to complete the square. So we're going to add in the blanks. So I'm going to write this as x squared plus 6x plus blank equals negative 1 plus blank. What? Do you have a question? Okay. So now we want to figure out what number do we want here that would make it so that we could complete the square. And in the previous part, we figured out how to find that C value. How do we make and find that C value?
9?
It's 9 because we take whatever value is right here, which happens to be 6. We divide that by 2, which makes 3, and then you square it. And 3 squared is 9. So 9 is the value that is going in each of my blanks. So now we are writing this part over here as a square. And we know the square is always going to become that half number. Okay? So my square is going to be x plus 3 squared equals, and negative 1 plus 9 is 8. So I'm going to stop there. Ask me if there's a part that you're not sure about, because I want to make sure we all understand what's happening here.
Is that the answer?
No. So if you were to factor x squared plus 6x plus 9, that would end up being x plus 3 squared. Because what adds to be 6 multiplies to be 9. But the shortcut is, instead of having to think through that, your square is always going to be whatever your half number was.
Okay, yes, the same.
Okay? Anybody else have questions?
So it's only plus or minus is like underneath the square itself. Right?
Oh, and then you have to...
So is it going to end up being plus or minus on this one when we take the square root?
No, because you did it from the square root.
Well, I haven't yet. But see how we have a square here? What am I going to do to solve this now?
Square both
Square root.
sides.
Good. We're going to square it both sides. So is this going to be a plus or minus?
Yes.
Yes. So we are going to have x plus 3 equals plus or minus. And can 8 break down
No.
to what? Good. We have 4 and 2 and a 2 and 2, so I have a pair of 2s, 2 left over. So I'm going to write this as 2 root 2. Did you have a question? Are you just stretching? Okay. And then would I set this up as 2 equations?
No.
Right, because you have a root and you won't be able to combine like terms because there won't be any like terms to add together. And so we can just leave our equation like this, except for we want x to be by itself. So I'd subtract 3 and I get x equals -3 plus or minus 2 root 2. So the plus or minus part always kind of goes in the back, and the number that isn't plus or minus is in the front. Okay? And this is your answer.
I'm still cracking up laughing.
Okay. Questions on example 4. All right. So example 5. Are all my x's together and my plain numbers on the other side? No. So what would I need to do first on this? Very good. Subtract 50 is correct. So now when I write this, I'm going to write it as x squared minus 12x, good, plus your blank, equals -50 plus my blank. Because whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other side, because that will make a balance. You can't just do something to one side because that would throw it off. Okay? So at this point, who remembers what we do next? Very good. We take half of this middle number. So I do -12 divided by 2, which makes -6, and then we square it, which makes, very good, positive 36. So 36 goes into each of my blanks. Okay, next what do I do? Yeah, we can combine like terms, but we're going to write it as a square. And so this as a square is going to be what? Very good, x minus 6 squared. Because x squared minus 12x plus 36 factors to be this, but our shortcut is whatever the half number is, that's what's going here. Okay, equals, and then we combine our like terms there, -50 and positive 36. We add those together, and what do we get? -14 is correct. Okay, so now what? Good, square root of both sides. And when I take the square root, I get x minus 6 equals, what is it? Good, plus or minus I root 14. Because 14 breaks out of 7 and 2, but I don't have any pairs, right? Okay, and then will I set this into 2 equations? No. So what am I just going to do? Except for x isn't by itself, so what do I need to do? Good, move the 6. So we add 6, and we have x equals 6 plus or minus I root 14 as our answer. Okay, questions?